Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer, and welcome to the day that I feel like my garden finally really begins for the year. Today we are going to plant our tomato plants into the ground. As you can see behind me, I'm not sure if you can really see that well, but I've lined up some tomato transplants along this trellis here, and in front of me I've lined up some tomato transplants along this other trellis. So as you can see, we've got lots of tomato plants to get in the ground today. I'm really excited to get started on this. So I'm just going to walk you through today how I plant my tomato plants for the healthiest plants and the maximum possible harvest. So we're going to start with this tomato plant here. This is a nice heirloom, Cindy's, West Virginia. As you can see, this is a nice, big, healthy transplant. Now, one thing that you're going to need to take into account when you plant tomato plants is that they need support. There's a variety of ways to do that. So people choose to support their tomato plants in lots of different ways. As you can see, I have this trellis wall behind me. I like to let them grow along this trellis wall, and as they grow, I tie them along the trellis wall with this little disposable kind of plastic tape that I use. There's lots of different options for that as well. I'm sure you've probably seen people grow tomatoes in a tomato cage. That is definitely an easy and fairly cheap option. That is not my preferred option if you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, because usually by the end of the season they're too tall and their fruit is too heavy to really be adequately supported by a tomato cage. But if that is the best option that you have, then go ahead and do that. I have grown many tomatoes in tomato cages that have grown and been successful. You'll see that I'm even going to be breaking my rule and growing some tomato plants that way this year as well, and I still anticipate that they're going to do well. For the best results and the healthiest plant, I do like to use something like this because it allows them to grow a little bit taller. It allows me to support them, to support the branches a little more individually if they need it. So this is my choice, but as I said, there are many other options. Some people like to use a tall, sturdy stake and tie their tomato plants to the stake as they grow. That would be a similar concept to this, but it does allow you a little bit more flexibility with how you organize your tomatoes in the garden. This is just my chosen method, but there are many other methods of supporting tomatoes. If you look online, you'll find all different kinds of methods for trellising tomatoes. You can find the Florida weave method. There are trellises where you can basically put in T-posts and make a bar going across the top of your tomato bed and tie your tomatoes to that as they grow. That can work great too. I just do this because it's simple, easy, fairly low maintenance, which honestly, if I'm going to stick to something in the garden, it needs to be pretty low maintenance. So this is what has worked for me the best so far. So as we turn our attention to this tomato seedling, you can see that as it's kind of been acclimating to the outdoors, it has already dropped some of its lower leaves. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and clip off some of these lower leaves here to give us a nice bare stem. So I definitely get it that removing the beautiful leaves from a tomato plant, especially if it's a plant that you have grown and nurtured from seed, it can feel a little bit painful and it can feel like you're really setting back the plant, but that is not actually the case. When you are putting your tomato plant into the ground, you know, it has all these beautiful leaves on top, and those are important because they do make energy for the plant. But what is really going to ultimately be basically the biggest factor in the plant's success is the root system that it's going to develop. Tomato plants basically have this superpower where all along their stem, any part that touches soil can grow new roots. So by planting this plant, see, if I just planted it at the same depth it's growing in the pot, it would have this nice little root system. It would eventually grow larger roots. It would send its roots down deep and do well. But if I clip off these lower leaves, I'm going to clip off these bottom two leaves that you can see here, and I'm going to plant it all the way up. So let me see if I can show you. Basically all the way up to about here, below this leaf. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow that entire section of stem that's going to be covered with soil to develop new roots. That's going to make my plant stronger. Once it gets that root system established, it's going to easily replace the little bit of top growth that I'm going to be removing from the plant. It's going to easily be able to surpass its current size. And what that's also going to do is it's going to make the root system deeper of the plant, which is going to make it a lot more drought resistant. The deeper that your plants, and this is true of all plants, not just tomatoes, the deeper that your plant is able to sink its roots into the soil, the more it's going to be able to access water that's deeper down in the soil, the more resistance it's going to have to dry spells. You're not going to have to be constantly watering your plant as often. So that is definitely something we want to encourage with our plant. So I am going to be clipping off those roots and burying it deeply. Now, one other option that you may see some people do as opposed to burying it deeply is to clip off these leaves, lay the tomato plant on its side, and bury it here. That creates a larger, wider root system, but a less deep root system. And what will happen is your tomato plant will bend and grow upright from the point where it's buried in the soil. So that is another option if you prefer not to dig a really large hole. So as I said in my case, I prefer to plant it deeply because I think that increases the drought resistance of the plant. But for example, if you have shallower soil, if you just don't have the ability to dig a really deep hole like that, laying on its side, that's called trenching it, that can be another option as well that will still allow it to get a really large developed root system, but it just won't be quite as deep, it'll be wider instead. Now you also want to make sure to prepare a site for your tomato plants by amending your soil. So this is a little bit dry right now because we've had a warm couple days, but if I dig down into the soil, you can see that underneath it's this beautiful, nice, rich soil. So over the course of many years in this garden, I have gradually built up my soil to be much higher quality than it was when I first started. Now, one way that I do that is by laying down several inches of compost basically right before each growing season. You could also do that in the fall if that works better. So a couple weeks ago, I prepared this bed for planting my tomatoes, and I did lay down a few inches of nice fresh compost. And what's going to happen is the worms are going to gradually work that into the soil. The nutrients in the soil are going to infuse into the soil as it rains. And just overall, that's going to increase the beneficial microbes in the soil, increase the nutrients in the soil. So you definitely want to make sure that you're giving your plants adequate nutrition. I prefer to do that with compost, but there are many other ways to amend your soil, so you can definitely look into that. So I'm just going to go ahead and right up against the trellis here, I'm going to dig a nice deep hole for my tomato seedling. So one thing that I'm sure you noticed when I removed the lower leaves from this tomato is that I pinched them between my fingers. You can either do that or you can use clippers. I don't recommend just tearing them because a lot of times tomato stems are very stringy, and so if you just tear a leaf, a lot of times it will tear a strip all down basically all down the edge of the stem, and then that exposes your stem to disease and rot and all kinds of things that you just really don't want your tomato to have. So you want to make sure just to pinch the leaves off or clip them rather than tear them. I'm just going to very gently remove my tomato plant from the pot. I'm going to place it down into the deep hole and smooth the soil back around it. And I'm going to put my marker here so I don't forget what type this is. So you can see my tomato plant looks much shorter now as it's been buried deeply, but it's going to be much healthier in the long run for that. One other factor that I should mention, because it's extremely important when you're planting tomatoes, is to make sure to plant after your threat of frost has passed. So you're going to want to look up the last frost date in your area. It's going to vary a lot depending on where in the world you are. And after that frost date, I encourage you to check your 10-day forecast, or after that, estimated last frost date, because it's not a set in stone thing. It's just based on a combination of weather predictions for the coming year and also historical averages. So taking those two things into account, they're going to estimate the last frost date for your area. So definitely don't take that as a hard and fast rule. Look at the estimate, and then when that date comes, check your 10-day forecast. Now, in my case, my last frost date is actually estimated to be tomorrow, but I've checked my 10-day forecast, and all of the lows in my area, I think the lowest low for the next 10 days is supposed to be 49 degrees Fahrenheit. That is nowhere close to freezing. So I feel comfortable planting my tomato plants out today. So you're just going to want to familiarize yourself with the weather in your area, talk to local gardeners, and get an idea of when the best time is to plant tomatoes out in your area. So I realized after I planted this tomato that it was actually not the tomato I tended to plant there. This tomato over here was the one I had earmarked for that hole. So this one will go next. So now that brings us to spacing. You're going to find so many different opinions on the proper spacing for tomatoes. And a lot of that is going to depend on how you're growing them and also your individual climate. Because of the way I'm trellising my tomatoes, I like to space them about 18 inches apart. You want to give them, most estimates will say at least 18 inches as a minimum. I tend to space all of my plants a little more closely than recommended, but because I'm trellising them, I can definitely space them more closely than if I was allowing them to sprawl on the ground. Now, it is definitely recommended, especially if you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, to trellis your tomato plants. Basically, an indeterminate tomato and a determinate tomato, those are the two types that you're going to find. Indeterminate tomatoes tend to get taller as the season goes on. They continue growing throughout the growing season. They continue to set new fruit throughout the growing season. For the most part, it's very variety dependent, but for the most part, you'll have a larger overall yield with an indeterminate tomato as opposed to a determinate, but it's very spread out over a long period of time. Now, that is really useful if you are looking to basically have fresh tomatoes for eating over a long period of time. If you are looking to preserve tomatoes to make tomato sauce or something like that, you might prefer a determinate tomato variety. Determinate tomatoes tend to get a little bit shorter. You might also see them called bush tomatoes. Those, I find, work fairly well being supported in tomato cages because they don't get as tall. Now, that's going to be personal opinion again, so you're just going to have to try things and see what works for you. But determinate tomatoes tend to set all of their fruit at the same time, or at least the majority of their fruit at the same time. So as the season goes on, they'll have flowers, they'll make fruit, and then they'll ripen that fruit pretty much within a very short window. Now, if you're looking for fresh eating, that may not be what you want because you might not want to have hundreds of tomatoes coming in all within the same week. But if you're looking to make tomato sauce, that might be exactly what you want. So choosing tomato varieties is really going to depend on what you are hoping to do with your tomatoes. The tomatoes that I'm growing on this trellis here are all indeterminate tomatoes. So because of that, I like to space them about 18 inches apart. I like to trellis them. So you might see many recommendations to space your tomatoes much further than 18 inches apart. Some people say 2 feet. I've even seen recommendations of 3 feet. That is really going to depend. Now, a lot of those recommendations are coming from a place of trying to maximize airflow for your plants. Tomato plants do tend to be fairly disease prone, and having more airflow between the plants definitely minimizes your chances of disease spreading or really taking hold. So there is a lot to be said for wider spacing. If I had a larger garden, I probably would space them a little more widely. Since I have limited space, I prefer to prune my tomatoes. We'll talk about that more as the season goes on. But I prefer to prune my tomatoes to keep them a little bit less unruly and space them about 18 inches apart. It's also going to be really climate dependent. If you live in an area with very hot, very humid summers, spacing them more widely and providing more airflow is going to be a lot more important in your area. So here is the second tomato variety. This is the one I showed you and said I was going to plant first, but I had a little mix up and planted that one first instead. So this one is going to go in the next spot. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove these lower leaves and plant this one nice and deeply as well. I'm also going to remove the little leaves growing in this little armpit of the stem here. Those are called suckers. Suckers are another thing that we'll talk more about when we get into tomato care as the season goes on. Today's focus is really just about getting them planted, but since those little suckers were there, I decided to remove those as well at the same time. So there we go. Tomatoes nice and planted. I'm just going to go down the row and plant the rest of these tomatoes back here, and then I'll show you what we planted. So here's our first trellis of tomatoes all planted. So here on the end I've got a climbing triple crop. Here I've got a Cindy's West Virginia. These two are both heirlooms that have done really well for me in the past. Next we have a Lemon Boy Plus. This is a hybrid that I'm trying for the first time. It had excellent reviews, so I'm really excited to see how it does. Next I have the Pink Ox Heart, which I tried last year for the first time and did really well for me, so I'm excited to grow it again. Then the Wisconsin 55. This is another one that did really well for me last year, so I'm excited to grow that. And then the Black Brandywine. This one did not do well for me last year, but I'm going to give it another chance because I'm really excited to try it and I want to see how well it does. That's the variety that I have planted on this first trellis. I'm actually going to get my little tie tape and tie these in place onto the trellis, and then I'm going to get them watered in, and then these will be ready to grow. So thank you so much for joining me in the garden today and planting tomatoes with me as we got all these plants off to a great healthy start. Throughout the season, I am going to be sharing all my tips for growing tomatoes, how I maintain them as they grow, how I keep them as healthy as possible, and how I get a great harvest from them. I'll also share my thoughts on each of these varieties and do a really nice thorough review at the end of the season. So I definitely hope you will join me again and see how my tomatoes and everything else in my garden are growing. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.